Hello and welcome everybody. Today we start the new series of lecture about the Panov attack and the Caro-Kann defense. Since we work mostly on the white's e4 move, so it's time for us also to find the right solution against the Caro-Kann defense, which is one of the most popular defensive continuation as black. So after c6, according to our principles, we continue with d2, d4, and black answers d5. So one of the main and the most important ideas of the Caro-Kann defense is just to attack white center, especially the e4 pawn, but at the same time not to lock this light square bishop as it happened usually in the French defense. After, let's say, e4, e6, d4, d5, so black for a while has a problem about his light square bishop, which is going to be passive for the while. So in the Caro-Kann defense we don't have such a problem. Indeed, after e4, e5, in case of advanced variation, so black could immediately develop the bishop to f5 and obtain quite okay position. The main theoretical line here is of course knight c3, and after d takes e4 and knight takes e4, so we just got into the classical position of the Caro-Kann defense. So here black would play bishop f5 line, which was extremely popular like 50 years ago when Mikhail Botvinnik met young Mikhail Tal in his world championship match. So then Caro-Kann defense was one of the main weapons against the attack and aggressive style of the young world champion. Also, the Caro-Kann defense was quite important part of the repertoire of a world champion Anatoly Karpov, and also the current world champion Vishy Anand sometimes used to play the Caro-Kann defense. And today, if we look at the top player in the ELO rating, Viselin Topalov, so even Viselin Topalov today plays the Caro-Kann defense, which is quite important sign for all the players in the world. So instead of classical move knight c3 or knight d2, which more or less leads to the same position after d takes e4, more than 70 years ago it was invented this opening line: e takes d5, c takes d5, and sometimes we call this position exchange variation of the Caro-Kann defense, because without much consideration white just exchange the pawns. And now, let's say, Fischer used to play bishop d3 in his games. Also this line sometimes popular even on the top level, but the most important, of course, continuation in that position is c2, c4. Very, very aggressive line. In the early 13 of the last century, Soviet master Vasily Panov just invented this interesting opening line. So when white is trying to break black center, just to attack very aggressively the black center, so of course the most important is the d5 pawn. We would like to get rid of it, and to despite the fact white could get the isolated pawn on d4, activity of white pieces in such a standard position of the isolated pawn fully compensate this slight weakness of this d4 isolated pawn in the center. This line become just one of the most playable in that lines against the Caracan defense. So let's say from the later 30 to, up to the almost the Second World War, the Mikhail Botvinnik, the greatest Soviet Union chess player on that on these years, just used to play very successfully the Panov attack in the Caracan defense. Also, let's say we know that in the early 20, Alexander Alekhin, another world champion, very successfully played c4 line in his games. And I would like just to start showing this interesting line from the game of Alexander Alekhin, which he played in 1935, and which is very, very typical for all the lines we are going to study. So after c4, of course, black could play simply d takes c4, but in that case, white immediately develops the bishop to c4, and all the pieces coming very, very fast into the game. So the most natural continuation for black here is just, of course, to play knight f6 and to take control over the direct white's aggression over the d5 square. Other lines, sometimes here black is playing knight c6, trying to counter-attack over the white d4 pawn, but that line I would not recommend for black, because after knight f3 or knight c3 immediately, so white is intending very hard to capture on d5, and which is almost forced black to play knight f6, since any move like d takes c4 leads to the dangerous position after d4, d5. White is winning territory and getting clear initiative. So knight f6, that's why is a better continuation. So black immediately taking control over the d5 square. At the same time, by the play knight f6, black is preparing the short castling after e6, bishop e7, and short castling next move. Knight c3. So already here black has a few options. First of all, cannot be recommended in this position move like bishop f5, because after queen b3 white is attacking both pawns, also d5, also b7, and blacks try to go for the counter-attack after knight c6, otherwise black is just losing pawn without any compensation. After c takes d5 and knight takes d4, in fact this is just blunder of the piece after queen a4 check. Knight on d4 is hanging, and knight cannot go back to c6. Simply d takes c6, white wins full piece. So queen a4 check, and then queen takes d4. Game is over. So if c takes d5, quite serious threat in that point. So also d takes c4 cannot be recommended, because simply bishop takes c4, white is intending checkmate in 1, and after e6 queen takes b7, simply pawn up and no any compensation for black. White wins almost in the opening. So one mistake, bishop f5, and black is going to pay so high price. So in that position, naturally black has two moves. I would say three moves, but two main moves. Knight c6, one move, e6 second move, and g6 third move. So all other moves are not so important in this situation. Instead, of course, black also could capture on c4, but that we will study later on, just how to play the typical ideas, how to play with the queen's isolated pawn on d4. So in the Alohin's game against Strasdis happened knight c6, bishop g5, one of the most aggressive continuation. Bobby Fischer used to play here knight f3 in his famous game against Max Euwe from Olympiad. Indeed, today this line is not so so popular because black has quite strong response with bishop g4, just counter-attacking white's position in the center very fast, and all white's attempt to get serious advantage today are not real, because after bishop g4 black is just intended to play simply e6 and to support the center very strong, and white's most aggressive attempt to play c takes d5, knight takes b5, and queen b3 also not so real, since after bishop takes f3, g takes f3 and e6, queen takes b7 and knight takes d4. Unfortunately for white, black is getting very strong counterplay, and which almost force white to go into the complication of the bishop b5 check. But once again, since we are studying today not the modern theory, but in general ideas of how to play in the opening, studying the opening principle, just I show this line just for you like information about the latest theory. King e7, queen takes b5, and now Max Euwe captured on c3, which allowed Fischer to fight for advantage after b takes c3. When today's theory recommends queen d7 with approximately equal endgame after knight takes d5, queen takes d5, queen takes d5, e takes d5. Black is having an isolated pawn on d5, but king simply goes to the center to e6, and the bishop coming to c5 or to d6. Just we have no pieces almost in the board to fight for initiative. So this line is still quite rare guest in the grandmaster practice, when white is trying to obtain slightly better endgame, but quite difficult to recommend to play this line for you. I mean, when you just like to get just active game and some interesting chess. So I cannot recommend this knight f3 move. When much more aggressive in that position after knight c6 for white is just to follow the main idea in the Panov attack. Fight for the center, fight for the d5 square. That's what happened in the game. Alokhin played bishop g5. And this is one of the most popular continuations, which also happened in the famous game between Mikhail Botvinnik and Rudolf Spielmann. It's quite interesting story about this game. When for the first time Rudolf Spielmann decided to use against Botvinnik the quite interesting gambit line. So he played queen b6, and after c takes d5, queen takes b2. According to his home analysis after now move like knight a4, black is getting quite good initiative. Unfortunately for Spielmann, Botvinnik prepared here just decisive novelty. It's not so difficult to understand that black, by moving the queen to b6 and capturing the pawn on b2, played against the opening principles, which we studied already for so many lessons, which says that it's very dangerous to move your queen so early in the opening when all your pieces are still undeveloped. So you have to pay very high price for it, and that's exactly what happened. But when he played rook c1, and suddenly we could realize that black is in almost losing situation. After knight b4 and knight a4, queen takes a2 and bishop c4, Spielmann found himself with a trapped queen on a2. The game just lasted another 2 moves. Bishop g4, but Winnik simply answered knight f3, not f3 of course, just white to allow black additional chances with queen takes b2. Simply knight f3, bishop takes f3, g takes f3, and here already on move 12, Rudolf Spielmann in the Moscow International Tournament 1935 called it a day against Mikhail Botvinnik, since after queen a3 and rook c3, the queen is trapped, so black has to give another piece for nothing. Knight c2 check. So this miniature shows once again that opening principles cannot be ignored, and you always have to think about it when you play the opening part in your game. Later on, this queen b6 move analyzed, and they found that after c takes d5, knight takes d4 and bishop e3, black still could fight somehow for the initiative after e5, d takes e6 and bishop c5, but not so many, I would say, like to play such a situation when your king on f7 under the threats of the checks, and despite the fact that black is having some compensation, the valuation of the line is clear advantage for white. So that's why queen b6 move already almost never played in a serious practice. So let's back to the Alokhin's game, which we continue to study. So that when we came to conclusion that queen b6 cannot be played, that black has only a few options here. So the most natural is when white played bishop g5 is just to take on c4 and to attack the pawn on d4. And the second one is to play e6, just trying to support the center. Indeed, also quite interesting opportunity for black here is to play bishop e6. So black is also trying to support the position of the pawn on d5. So in this game, which we studied, so happened d takes c4. And d4, d5. Only later on, Alokhin came to conclusion that even possible here to sacrifice the pawn and to go for the gambit, real gambit continuation. So this is we call Alokhin's gambit in the Caro-Kann Panov line. So after bishop takes c4, black has two options, or to capture on d4 with the knight or with the queen, but this we will study later on. So let's continue today with main ideas on the Panov attack in the Caro-Kann defense. d4, d5, that move was played by Alokhin in that game. Knight e5. Still, even today, this position is quite, I would say, interesting from a theoretical point of view. Botvinnik against Floor played here queen d4. Also this game we will study later on. But in that game Alokhin moved the knight to f3. So white doesn't pay much attention about the c4 pawn. The most important just to bring all the pieces in the game. Now, in case of knight takes f3 and queen takes f3, white is going to win the pawn back. The king could go for the long castling, and for black is extremely difficult to finish the development. e6 long castling, g6, and after Long castling and bishop takes e4 also quite unpleasant situation. Maybe g6 was the best line. Indeed, black decided to play a6. Sorry, black decided to play here knight d3 first, trying to take the two bishops c takes and queen takes d3, but we can realize that instead of fighting somehow for the development, black is now having all his pieces are still on the back rank. So white has all the pieces in the game. Next move was short castling, or long castling, then rooks very fast coming to the center to d1 and e1, and the game more or less finished. a6, short castling, e6, rook a to d1, almost finishing black already. E takes d5. It's not better was to play bishop e7 since white intending d6 anyway, with a just winning position for white. Yeah, but e takes d5 of course cannot save black anymore. Alohin played simply bishop takes f6, queen takes f6, knight takes d5, and after queen d8 finishes the game with very elegant move. But of course, look at the position, look at the situation. White is having all his pieces in the game, black just totally undeveloped. It's not a big deal here to find the decisive move, but still it's quite nice. Knight f6 check. So black cannot recapture with the pawn because queen takes d8. Black has to capture with the queen, but now intermediate move, rook f to e1. According to the principles, when your opponent's king is the center, open the position, open files and diagonals for your pieces, and the game will be decided very soon. So now, in case of bishop e7, we play queen d8, checkmate. In case of bishop e6, we play queen d7, another nice checkmate situation. So, this very fast miniature, just 15 moves, played by Alohin against Stradis in Riga, 1935, and once again showing how important to follow the opening principles when you play the chess game. Also, what we already studied from just the short overview of the Panov attack in the Caracan defense. That the e takes d5 and c takes d5 and c4, white is trying very, very strong pressure over the black's d5 pawn. One game I found here, which was played d takes c4, bishop takes c4, and a6. Also, black was trying to play against the principles and could be punished very, very fast. Knight f3, knight c6. Already now, d4, d5 was quite strong. Short castling. e6, knight c3, knight f6. And because black played this a6 move, which is loss of a tempo, white could break through the center after d4, d5, sends to the very bad position of the king on e8. d4, d5. Knight a5, trying to win the pawn on c4, and now white comes with a nice combo. Look at that. D takes A6, sacrifice, queen takes D1, necessary, because if you recapture that way, simply check with a huge domination. King takes F7, queen takes D8. So queen takes D1 is necessary. E takes F7 check, king E7, rook takes D1. Knight takes C4, B3. Now, black is going to lose back the piece because knight D6 will be met by bishop A3. Moving the knight to B6 after knight G5, still white is keeping very strong attack. So in the game happened H6, bishop A3 checkmate. It's quite nice finish. But even black is not going to miss it. White is having just enormous attack for just one piece when white already has 2 pawns as a compensation and a lot of threats. Bishop A3, bishop E3, rook E1, etc. Once again, black paid for just one mistake in the opening. A6, and which allowed white to break through the center very fast. Okay, so let's look at that critical position. I would like just to show you after C4 a few more games. Which also happen in my practice from my games on ICC. So in one game, after knight F6, knight C3, knight C6, bishop G5, while one of my opponents played bishop E6. The main problem here is that black cannot play next move d takes C5, d takes C4, sorry. That's why after knight F3, when my opponent played d takes C4, he suddenly realized that bishop takes F6, e takes F6, or g takes F6, D4, D5. Black is losing a piece in a game. Game is over. So much better for black in this position. Instead of capturing, black has to play a queen d7 or g6, but in any case the position of the bishop on a6 cannot be recommended. Bishop f5, as I said before, cannot be recommended because queen b3, just intending b7 and d5. So one of my opponent played here b6, but of course c takes d5, e6, bishop b5 check, just trashing black's position without any problem. Knight bd7, knight f3, e takes d5. I just here decided just even not to capture the pawn on d5. Just short castling, ready to bring my rook to e1. Bishop e7, rook e1. Now bishop e6 could be met by knight g5 and black is going to lose a pawn anyway, or bishop c6. After short castling knight takes d5, white got just extra pawn with no any compensation. My opponent immediately blundered here, played bishop e6 and takes d5. Sends to the pin over the e file, black is going to lose a full piece. Knight takes d5, queen takes d5, and my opponent immediately resigned. And one more game. After e4, c6, d4, d5, e takes d5, c takes d5, c4, knight f6, knight c3, knight c6, bishop g5. So after bishop g5, move which we are going to study seriously, one of my opponents played bishop f5. Overlook that after bishop takes f6, g takes f6, and c takes d5, the position is almost over. Knight b4, met by queen a4, resigned. So black has to be very, very careful about the d5 square. So maybe d takes c4 after d5 and knight e5. Once I used the Alohin's recommendation and played here knight f3. And instead of knight d3, which probably is a very bad move, knight takes f3 also cannot be recommended. And probably only chance for black here is trying to develop the piece after bishop g4. Indeed, my opponent played here queen c7, queen d4. White is ready to double pounce after knight takes f3, but to develop very, very aggressively the bishop next and threaten to complete the development very fast after long castling. My opponent answered knight fd7. I just continue with the same style, long castling. Knight takes f3, g takes f3, knight b6, bishop f4, queen d8, bishop takes c4, knight c4, queen takes c4. Easy to see once again, black pieces totally undeveloped and all are sleeping after bishop d7 and rook h2 e1. There is no way for black to finish the development. White played all according to the principles. Rook in the center. So always I can play king b1 just to go away from the pin over the c file. Queen c8 played my opponent. Queen b3, e6, king b1, b6, take on e6, knight e5, so position was already lost. Black has no way to stop knight c7, king f7, knight c7, rook b8, and here I came with quite nice but easy combination. Rook takes d7, check. Threatening the discovery, check. Knight c5, knight g5. At the same time, threatened bishop takes b8. So after king f6, bishop takes b8, my opponent immediately resigned. He's having not just a piece down, but the whole position is totally demolished. So this, what could happen when you play against the opening principles in the Panov attack of the Caracan defense. So today was part 1 in the new series on Gambit Guide about Caracan defense. If you have any question, you can contact me on my website www.chesslessons.wordpress.com. I will be happy to answer any of your questions. And see you next time. Bye.